Everyone. Welcome to the Sharmin Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies seminar series. This week's talk is The Unbearable Lightness of the Lowbrow, Historical Narratives of Modern Theater in Iran with Q-Mars Haeri. Q-Mars received his PhD in 2024 in Theater and Performance Studies from the University of Maryland, College Park. He is a theater historian and practitioner whose research interest is on cultural production in Iran. For the past couple of years, Haeri served as a faculty member and director of the theater program at the American University of Kuwait. Haeri is currently working on developing his dissertation project, Popular Theater in Iran, A Social History of Lalezari Performances, into a manuscript. The project focuses on Lalezar, one of the most important theater districts in Tehran. He hopes to write a social history of this district's mid-20th century that questions how we categorize cultural products, either with dignity and as sublime, or as degenerate and vulgar, and to what extent these categorizations are influenced by notions of class, religion, and the urban-rural divide. Please join me in welcoming Q-Mars.
Okay, thank you so much, Maral. I appreciate it. Thank you for this introduction. I also want to thank Maral for another thing, because this past week she brought a lot of good Iranian sweets, and I ate most of them. So yeah, thank you so much. That's amazing. Thank you all for being here. I appreciate everybody's being here. And I also want to thank my wife, who's been here for the past week, and so helping me out. Thank you so much. One other thing I do want to say that, so my work is influenced by a lot of different people, but one person in particular is Aida Miftahi, whose work on gender and dance is amazing. So read her book. Yeah. And also, this is a work in progress, so I'm looking forward to hear your thoughts on it. Okay, let's start. Mutrib and Hunarmand, joy maker and artist. There has been a century-long tension between these two terms, both used to indicate a performer, yet with distinct connotations. Hunarmand was known to be serious, upscale, committed, while Mutrib was perceived as unbearably light, unbearably uncultured, and unbearably vulgar. We are starting our story from the 1940s Tehran. Hunarmand benefited from the political openings in that decade and put on stage political shows at the heart of the country's theater making, the Lalezar Entertainment District. Mutrib, however, had to go to the outskirts of the district or even the city to express their passion for theater. Hunarmand was there to cleanse the Mutrib, and the Mutrib was there fighting every day to survive. Lalezar was an entertainment district in Tehran for the most of 20th century. It hosted many different kinds of performances during its lifespan. In the 1940s, the quote-unquote golden age of Lalezar, the district was home to a la mode clothing stores, an acting school, many theaters, including one funded by the Tudeh Communist Party. In popular memory, however, Lalezar is most famous for its popular performances in the 1960s and 70s, the time that established theater historians called it the decline of Lalezar. In the late 1930s, Iran saw growth in bureaucracies of all kinds, and this not only affected governmental and judicial matters, but it also affected arts immensely. In a way, this created a system in which the government could interfere with artistic matters like never before. The bureaucratization of arts started with the establishment of the Organization for Thought Cultivation, OTC, Sazman Parvarish Afkar, in 1938. As Abrahamian mentions, OTC was modeled on fascist Italy and Nazi Germany propaganda machines that started a system in which performing artists had to apply for permission for obtaining show licenses. But OTC was not only a censorship office, it was also an educational institution. Under the organization, a new performing arts school was established. هنرستان هنرپیشگی or the acting school, was founded in 1939 in Lalazar Street and under the supervision of Sayyid Ali Nasr, who worked to educate actors. Sayyid Ali Nasr was known as the father of Iranian theater. He was one of the pioneers of modern theater in Iran, and he strongly opposed motribs. He studied in France, and when he returned to Iran, he founded a theater company called Comédie Iran, or Comédie Iranienne, with the aspirations for Iran to have a theater much like its French namesakes. For Nasr, this change was at the expense of Motrebi theater. Dariush Asadzadeh, a theater manager, grasps Nasr and his company members' hesitation of Motrebi in the following sentence. They knew this kind of theater as Motrebi, and they came to cleanse it. One of the teachers of the acting school was Abdul Hussein Nushin. Nushin, much like Nasr, studied in France and furthered Nasr's effort to bring a French ideal to Iranian theater. Unlike Nasr, however, Nushin was a high-ranking member of the Tudeh Communist Party, and for him, theater should have purpose and message. Nushin was interested in, quote, elevating Iranian theater from what it was. To do so, one of the strategies that he had was to eliminate any music that could be associated with Motrebi. He was so against Iranian popular music that, as one of his colleagues mentioned, he did not even let his wife dance to it at parties. He was perhaps more fascinated with French theater than older Iranian theatrical traditions. He brought a Western theater discipline and European audience etiquette to Iran. He did not like people cheering when they watched an act, apparently. More importantly, he was very much interested in elevating theater language, as he was opposed to the ways in which French plays were previously adapted to Persian. The older adaptations were very much suited for Motrebi plays, but Nushin was interested in translating those plays to a, quote, fine language. For the gatekeepers of legitimate theater of the 1940s, the written language always had the high ground. One way to describe the social field that Lalazar district was in that decade is to describe the Persian language dispositions of its plays and residents. On the one hand, there were those whose work were adaptations of classical Iranian literature. Those works were inspired by Shahnameh or other classical Iranian epic and romantic works, and therefore created an archaic-sounding Persian in performance. Moreover, as Nusrat Karimi, a practitioner of the time, mentions, many of the utterances were an imitation of Armenian accent, as many legitimate theater directors of the time were Armenian Iranians. On the other hand, there were those who had studied abroad and brought Western texts to Lalazar stages. Most notably, Abdul Hussein Nushin did this. As mentioned, in his translations, he was known to create a distinct, fine theatrical language. The kind of language that he created was so specific, which has been characterized as, quote, academic school of theater expression. His approach was to use the same structure of written translated language, then change the pronunciation of some of the words to spoken Persian. He also kept a few words in written format. Some describe this form as cultured and poetic spoken language. This cultured spoken language was invented in part to create a distinction with spoken language that Motribs used. Karimi mentions that for Nushin, Motrebi language was not appropriate and made the pieces mubtazal, like vulgar or degenerate. Therefore, one can argue that the social distinction between Motribs and Honarmands were embedded in the legitimate theater language DNA since the 1940s, if not before. Motribs were not unaware of these differences, and as Dariush Asadzadeh, theater manager, mentions, declame, which was a form of reading poetry slowly, loudly, and with clear articulation, was one of Nushin's favorite utterance methods, and Motribs used to make fun of this kind of overtly expressive language in their performances. As time passed, Nushin's theatrical language became a standard practice among many playwrights in Iranian legitimate theater. For decades, for decades, there were few who found it problematic and few who scrutinized it as much as they did with plays by Motrebs in popular performances. As Bourdieu writes in The Economic of Linguistic Exchange, the dominant class can make deliberately or accidentally lax use of language without their discourse even being invested with the same social value as that of the dominated. What speak is not the utterance, the language, but the whole social person. The acting school and the practitioners it trains created a distinction between themselves and Motrebs. In the 1940s Lalezar, which is known as the golden age of the district, those who were literate and practiced theater were not fond of Motrebs and did not recognize Motrebi as theater. They focused on literary theater and put aside any kind of non-literary performances. They attempted to establish their position as normal, in Goffman terms, and normal theater practitioners. Many of the alumni of the school later became key theater managers, famous actors, and otherwise gatekeepers of theater, such as theater historians. But the school never allowed Motrebs to study in it, as Motrebs lacked literacy to begin with. If a practitioner did not study in the acting school, they did not have a chance in performing in Lalezar theater in the 1940s. As one Motreb mentions, the actors of these cultural centers, meaning the theaters in Lalezar, were all literate and had high school diplomas. Having a diploma was very important at that time. Any actor who wanted to work in these centers might first undergo a 6-month training course. Theater work had its own rules and programs. Motrebs were a class of musicians, actors, dancers, and performing artists who usually came from minoritarian or disenfranchised backgrounds. Motrebs were organized in a troupe and under a troupe leader. In early to mid-20th century, they gathered and found performance opportunities through a bungah shademani, like a happiness company. Their varied performances, called Motrebi, the adjective form of Motreb, include dances, short musical scenes, short sketch comedies, and improvisatory theater. Beyond the pseudo-aesthetic attributes of light, uneducated, vulgar, and so on, there are somewhat invisible attributes that Motrebs shared. We already talked about language, but more importantly, many Motrebs suffered from extreme poverty. As one Motreb reflected on his childhood, after his parents passed, he and his siblings were in a situation that they had to eat other people's excess food for some times. He says in an interview, "We had a neighbor. We lived in the Marmar Bat Alley. We spent the night there. They would give us a bite of the food they ate. There was a chicken coop nearby. You wouldn't wish that on your worst enemy. We would go and sleep there. I worked as a masseur in the bath for a while. They would give me 1 rial and I would massage them. I would scream with happiness that I have 1 rial. You could eat something with that money. I slept in a chicken coop at night." Many Motrebs started performing in their early teenage years. For many, survival was interwoven with becoming a performer, because performance is a survival strategy. It is a strategy to create a community of your own, to find and organize other disenfranchised persons of the society under a troupe, a performance, or even a rehearsal day. It's also a strategy to act as someone else, embody a character, to imagine, visualize, and through its utopian performatives, create a more just and better world, even for a few moments. Most Motrebs had to work and could not attend schools as children. As a result, many of them lacked literacy. Literacy, or lack thereof, is and was always an attribute contributed to social status. Yet, in the pre-20th century era, when there were only a few literate people in the population of Iran, this social status did not stratify large number of people because only a few were literate. In the present time also, literacy does not create large divisions since there are only a few illiterates in the country. The 20th century, however, as a liminal era in which the Iranian society at large was slowly changing its literacy status, created unjust conditions for large numbers who did not become literate. One Motreb who worked during his childhood as a peddler and a food seller reflects on his early life. In my own childish world, I was unhappy. I was happy that if I could not go to school and learn to read and write, I could at least make money. And maybe one day I could make enough money that I no longer need to work and I can go to school, buy books, play with my classmates with peace of mind. For this Motreb, literacy was a childhood dream. If the acting school was the institution for legitimate performers to get educated, coffee houses, streets, and weddings were the educational institutions for Motrebs. When they were young, they would often go to see older Motreb performances and then get together in streets to perform what they learned from that Motreb. As children, they watched other Motrebs and imitated them. Watching older Motrebs and doing as they did filled the gap for the non-existent formal education. Imitation was a performative means to transfer knowledge. Moreover, imitation organically and fluidly changed and refined Motrebi repertoire. In other words, when Motreb imitated other Motrebs, they pick and choose from and refine the other Motrebs' performances. The repetition of this process shaped the full repertoire of Motrebi. The streets were the learning grounds for Motrebs, but most of the time, troops shaped in the streets were not permanent. There were mostly teenage gatherings, and some were just there for their friendship rather than pursuit of an acting career. After a while, some would leave the troupe, and some would leave the city at all. Moreover, because these troops were not protected by any kind of official entity, as soon as they started to attract a large crowd, the police would come and disperse everyone. Or the municipality would not let them perform. Because of this situation, talented Motrebs who wanted to move forward with their career needed a more official way or a theater space to grow professionally and financially. And while theaters at Ladazar were not available to them in the 1940s, they had other ways to go around it. So the Happiness Company. In the 1940s, on Cyrus Street, in the 1940s on Cyrus Street, there were multiple stores that provided happiness for the customers. Those stores would give services of music, dance, and performance for the customers' parties and weddings. They were called Bongah Shademani Happiness Company, or for short, Bongah. What can be corroborated from memoirs and interviews is that these companies put together Motrebs in groups of around 10 and send them to various places for performance. These could be one show in the neighbor, one show in the neighbor alley, or a set of shows in another city. Artists from other cities would also come to find the talent that they need for their troupe. In some ways, the concept of a Bongah, or a happiness company, is the opposite of companies in legitimate theater. While one is rigid in the structure, the other connects artists to each other fluidly. Bongah is not a traditional theater company, nor it is a performing space. It does not have any qualities that binds artists together under a particular structure. It basically functions as a trade market for artists, troupe leaders, theaters, and most importantly, daily customers of performance. But it is also not just a market. Bongah worked as a hub for artists to get together, to get to know each other, and rehearse for events. Other than ceremonies in private houses, the street, and in coffee houses, in the 1940s, there were a few theaters which Motrebs used to perform in. Some of these theaters were near or in Shahreno, the red light district in the southern outskirts of Tehran. Perhaps most important figure whose effort gave Motrebs the access to theatrical venues was Babraz Soltani. Similar to many other Motrebs, Soltani was an orphan and illiterate. He had a great voice and used to perform as a king character like Keykhosro and Harun al-Rashid. Because of this, he was known by his stage name Sultan or Soltani. Given his great voice, he also used to perform in religious theaters as saints. To ta'ziyeh. Eventually, with costumes he owned when performing kings and saints and other costumes that he gathered, he assembled the largest archive of costumes for mutribs. He established arguably the second Bongah Shadmani. He first had a kiosk and then an office space when he stored all his costumes. With his archive, he was most suitable financially than other mutribs of the time. Okay. Given his financial leverage, he became the first mutrib who rented a venue. Shukufeno, at the beginning was the Cafe Shukufeno and then became the Kabare Shukufeno. Later, he partnered with others to establish another venue there, Tamashakhane Iran. With these venues, mutribs has opportunities between places they wanted to perform in. With the inherent fluidity in the ways in which mutribs navigate their lives and arts, they adapted their performance to modern theater configurations of stages of Shukufeno and Tamashakhane Iran. They remodeled, built, and managed those venues for themselves. This access to physical venues had also a financial benefit, given that venues are bound spaces in which the access of audience members can be regulated by ticket prices. These venues created fund for them in new and more sustainable ways. It also gained them a reliable audience waiting for them every night. Although their venues were mostly in the outskirts of the city, having this visible, reliable audience, they created a competition with the legitimate theaters in the Lalazar of that time, which was located at the center of the city. Mutribi spaces formed an alliance of minoritarian and individuals and disenfranchised groups of society. It was one of the most diverse communities in the country, with Jewish immigrants and other performers working together with those practices that marginalized mutrib not only survived, but gained cultural capital and shifted the power dynamics of the capital's culture. In the late 1950s and early 1960s, mutrib gained access to Lalazar theaters. So like 2 decades later. Lalazar managers invited them to perform. The common narrative about how mutribs gained access to theaters in Lalazar is that this happened as a result of a political change. In a similar analysis, one that winks to the conspiracy theories, some narrate that the Shah planned a way for them to perform in Lalazar to defame theater. Yet something that is missing from all this narrative is how hard the mutrib worked since the 1940s to undo their invisibility, to gain sustainable access to their audience, and fight against their stigmatization. The narrative trends mutribs as an agentless result of the 1953 coup is as if there was nothing done professionally by them to pave their way to their visibility and access to Lalazar. Okay. How's everybody doing? Okay. Okay. Lalazari is an adjective form from the word Lalazar, referencing the entertainment district. This term is used as a derogatory term to characterize aesthetic forms, particularly music, set design, costume design, and movement. When I'm using the term, however, I'm not pertaining to the word's negative connotation. Rather, I use the term to discuss the genre of theater created in the early 1960s in Lalazar. As I mentioned, in the mid-20th century, mutribs started to work along with other classes of performing artists, such as magicians, acrobatic performers, and dancers. This collaboration first started in the venues in South Tehran in the red light district. Beginning with late 1950s and early 1960s, mutribs and other popular performers joined Lalazar district. And their companionship resulted in theater and other kinds of performances that were unique to Lalazar of the time. Therefore, I define Lalazari as the kind of theater that was created in around early 1960s, which was a result of collaboration between mutribs, some of the older practitioners of Lalazar, and other popular performers. During this time, Lalazar mostly featured shows in theaters, cafes, and venues known as cabaret. Variety segments there were called attraction, and all of them did variety segments. It included magicians, acrobat shows, dancers, and musicians. These performers were either coming from Motrebi background, such as Jamile the dancer, or they were provincial immigrants such as Aghasi, who was from Khuzestan, or Saber Atashin, who was from Azerbaijan, or Susan, who was from Kurdistan, or some of the older performers of Lalezar whose work was close to Motreb's, such as Mortaza Ahmadi and Afat. Or they also asked foreign performers who were invited to theaters and by theater and cabaret managers. One of the most important theaters of this era was a theater called Tehran Theater, or Nasr Theater. Later it changed to Nasr Theater. And I'm just going to call it Nasr Theater for now. The theater managers of Nasr, Fatullah Vala, invited the Turkish circus and the Royal Indian Circus to perform a variety of pieces in their theater. Asadzadeh described an attraction show in Nasr in this way. So this is how they did shows in those eras. It was a program consisting of a singer singing for about 15 minutes, a dancer dancing for about 15 minutes, and an acrobat act for about 15 minutes, and a juggler for about 15 to 20 minutes, and a comedy show for an hour or little more. Spectators could see this collection for a small amount of 2 to 5 months. And comparing to when they could go to cafes, they had to pay 10 times more of this. In a way, Asadzade's description showed that in his time, what was happening in a theater was similar to a cabaret. It also suggests that attraction was popular with both working class and higher class audiences, and theaters made it possible for those with lower income to see the shows which others had the privilege to watch. Unlike in the previous era in Lalezar, in which songs and dance pieces were presented before shows in segments known as Pish Parde or Prelude, new theater plays during this period included variety pieces within the storyline of the play. Asadzadeh believes that the play Bezan Berim Amrika, Let's Go to America, in 1958, by Fatullah Vala in Nasr Theater was the first play that started in this trend. This play is about a young boy whose father takes him to a theater, and he watches half-naked European dancers on stage. Along the same line, active writers of Lalezar wrote adaptations of plays that were already popular with this new trend. This kind of play not only became the norm, but the style was soon adapted into cinema. In the late 1950s, playwrights of Lalezar, such as Parviz Khatibi and Salar Eshqi, did cinematic adaptations of Nojek Mr. Dollar, Mark Twain's The Million-Pound Banknote, and Moliere's The Miser. These films had variety segments in them. During the same time, many non-adaptation films with similar characteristics were created. Now I want to turn to a historiography question. How has this history been written? I want to consider the way in which prior endeavors of Iranian theater history have approached and depicted Lalezari performances. Therefore, I want to turn your attention to 3 Iranian theater history books and the ways in which they describe, theorize, and historicize Lalezari theater. Mustafa Oskui's book, Crossover the History of Iran Theater, is a representative of a handful of theater history books which have been written by writers who had a relationship with the Tudeh Communist Party. This has caused those histories to emphasize, admire, and affirm committed theater and dismiss, denounce, and stigmatize Lalezari theater. Malekpour's book, The History of Dramatic Literature in Iran, focuses on play texts, and therefore Lalezari performances becomes absent, because those performances are overwhelmingly improvisational or non-textual. Floor's book, The History of Theater in Iran, is the only theater history which has been written by non-Iranians, echoes well-known historical narratives of Iranian theater with a focus on the Iranian avant-garde in the 60s and 70s. In response to those books, Iranian theater history can be divided in 3 kinds of foci. those who emphasize the committed arts, those who emphasize the Iranian avant-garde, and those who emphasize the literature. This act of insistence on committed avant-garde or any kind of theater as opposed to popular has been discussed by Alan Woods in his article Emphasizing the Avant-Garde, an Exploration in Theater Historiography. I borrow Wood's idea about the relationship between the popular and the avant-garde to discuss the ways in which Iranian theater histories have navigated Lalezari performances. Discussing the biases of theater historians, Woods writes, while theater historians cannot be faulted for reflecting the biases of their time, it should be possible to explore some of the effect those biases have on the way theater is studied. Building on his thoughts, I'm recognizing the effect of such biases on Iranian theater history writing, not only on the way in which theater is studied, but also the way that is practiced, spectated, and lived. Books such as Crossover, The History of Iran Theater by Oskoui explicitly dismiss popular theater. It largely focuses on specific genres of theater, which can in one way to another be committed to the communist message. In the only 3 pages that he develops on the history of popular theater, Oskoui refuses to call it theater at all and only calls it motrebi. Building on a Greek philosopher whom I could not identify, he wants to convey that since the time of ancient Greeks, popular performances were separate entities from arts. He asserts that since light and easy performances of motrebi with its songs and dances are for the sole aim of joy, they cannot be part of art, which should have risalat va pegham, purpose and message. Then he suggests that the reason that popular performances were allowed to be performed in theaters in the 50s and 60s has something to do with the Shah, because Shah wanted to defame theater. And since, in Oskoui's view, Motrebi theater has a bad reputation, the Shah gave space to them to stigmatize theater at large and then take down serious theater, like Teatr Jeddi. He asserts that the Shah was the one who benefited. Indeed, further in his book, when he analyzes Nasr theater, not only does he dismiss the kind of theater that was practiced there in 1950s and 60s, but writes that the theater itself was pro-Shah. Vibrantly visible in his book is a chart where he splits theaters between pro-Shah and pro-nation. This chart is titled Our Place in the Clear Mirror of Time. Under pro-Shah, he names Shah's prime minister who helped with the 1953 coup. He names a wrestler who was actively pro-Shah during the coup. Added on the list is the Tehran Theater, or the Nasr Theater, and its director Ahmad Dehqan. On the other side of this division, under pro-nation, are the names of the democratic leader Mohammad Mossadegh, who was subject of the coup d'etat just mentioned, followed by Abdul Hossein Nushin, the communist theater director that we talked about, and his theater Saadi. Underneath this clear mirror, Oskoui restates his thoughts that specifically the project of Nasr theater has been an active manipulation on the part of the Shah against theater. Naturally, these accusations have been heard by the practitioners in Nasr theater in the 1960s and 70s. Their thoughts and reactions, however, have not been echoed in history books. They exist in other forms. Hassan Azimi, for example, was a practitioner of Nasr theater. He says many so-called intellectuals derided our work and said we speak worthless nonsense and just do ridiculous things. He writes in his memoir. He indicates that contrary to the view he found performances in Lalezar quite anti-establishment and rebellious, recalling many of the plays where the main characters rebels against the king. He remembers that often when he starts the plays, he would start with this monologue: "Ladies and gentlemen, until when you are going to go after the beautiful Farrokh Laga, Think a little about science and morality. Find out what science and knowledge and politics is all about. Find out how the world works. The purpose of a play is to show you what is what and what it all comes down to. Thinking about Azimi's statement in his memoir, even if the Lalezari performances were not committed arts, as Oskui wanted theater to be, surely one can argue that they were not against any commitment to the people. Perhaps these performances were not there to defame theater. Perhaps they were not the tool for the Shah. Perhaps the mirror is not so clear after all. Willem Floor, in his book, The History of Theater in Iran, recognizes that the inspiration of much of the 60s and 70s quote-unquote avant-garde Iranian performances, like that of Mofid or established practitioners such as Nasirian, had came from quote-unquote traditional performances. But he forgets to mention that those traditional performers, were still alive in Lalezar streets in those decades. They were an important part of Tehran's theater scene, and some remains in existence until 2003. Moreover, Floor recognizes popular performances as part of the tradition, or sunnat, as opposed to understanding them as alive, breathing, and contemporary performances. His book is detailed and nuanced concerning such performances when talking about before the 20th century, but those performances become traditions when they step into the 20th century. This suggests that if Mofid has found inspirations in Lalezari performances, he had dug into the past to find those inspirations. It suggests that if Nasirian has done something close to Lalezari performances, he has done a revival of a dead past rather than a conversation with an alive trend of theater making. The only instance that Floor mentions the live popular theater of post-1903 are instances that he quotes Oskui, and he relies on Oskui for 20th century theater and cites him frequently. As a result, the book portrays Oskui's own company as a savior of Iranian theater. Among all the history books being discussed, Malekpour's book, Dramatic Literature in Iran, is one that has been written with an academic tone. This book has carefully cited every piece of evidence that is provided. And as he writes in the introduction of the book, the book is only a history of what is known. As it is evident in this book, we have only discussed the text of the plays, and we have not spoken about performance and the stage agents unless briefly in relation to the play text. Malekpour described plays, reviews, and any piece of writing about theater as dramatic literature, and therefore his book is dealing with those kinds of evidence. Because of the historiographical choice that Malekpour made, his work does not have the opinionated tone of Oskui or Floor. But Malekpour work holds, while Malekpour work holds academic significance, a set of questions arises. To what extent can such an approach toward theater, primarily a live communicational art, can be effective? What parts of theater history such approach covers, and which parts does it put aside? Writing the history of the ephemeral, non-textual, and often improvisational theater needs a kind of historical writing which connects dots between text, documents, and actual performances, which reasonably and carefully speculates the empty voids and thoughtful guesses and assumes. Okay, I'm gonna move forward to my end because I know I have 5 minutes. Oh, perfect. Thank you, I appreciate it. Okay, so I'm just gonna say a quote by Oday Johnson, which is about thinking about non-textual theater, how to exhume and honor history that is largely unacknowledged by the survivor on a stage constitutionally incapable of remembering it. Whose history? On a Thursday night in 2002, popular practitioners in Nasr Theater received a 24 hours notice to gather their belongings, say goodbye to their beloved theater, and evacuate the historical building. In the course of 24 hours, the longest theater in Tehran was forced by the municipality to be closed. On the next Sunday, newspapers wrote short pieces about the closure. Later, they cited the city officials who said that the closure was due to building safety codes, preventing a possible collapse of one of the walls. The theater practitioners who had lived in the theater for a long time could not identify any unsteady wall. They refused to believe that the immediate shutdown of the theater had anything to do with safety issues. Rather, they thought this was a direct attack against one of the last theaters standing in the Lalazar streets. A deep-seated attack by some artists, communists, and religious activists who for decades had called their theater making unworthy, deceptive, and false. In the days which followed, they demanded their theater back, stating that they cannot and do not want to work in serious theater in fashionable neighborhoods. Their demand was refused. Questions remain. What happened to the artists whose lives relied on their theater making? What happened to their audience whose presence can still be felt and whose laughter can still be heard in the empty auditorium? What happened to the empty theater building, the empty space? In a conversation between Nasr theater practitioners following the 2002 forcible closure of the theater, what is quite striking is that they think that the narratives against them are the sole reason for the closure. One of them says, okay, there is what's called serious theater, but why can't we exist alongside it? He continues, here is a popular audience that likes this kind of theater, a friendly theater that talks to them about their lives. Now the door of the theater have been closed. What about these actors who modestly performed their arts? Listening to this voice, something struck me deeply. I used to think that the narratives of the past, especially those which were written in cultural history books, may shape the way in which we study theater, we think about theater, but not the practitioners' works and lives. The story of performers and joy makers of Lalazar, though, suggests that not only did these narratives shape what theater historians wrote, but the narratives also threatened theater making in the real world. They are deeply connected to people's lives and careers. That they can change public spectatorship, as we have seen in the case of Nasr Theater in 2002 and many other Lalazar theaters before. This was a post-mortem report. It was a story of a theater after its ghost lights went dark and never came back on again. A story of ghosts haunting, maintaining, and preserving the dark stage of Nasr Theater in Tehran.
Thank you. Thank you, Qmars, for a wonderful presentation. We now do have about a little less than 15 minutes for questions from the audience. Oh. Okay. So because there are many hands, I kindly request that everyone be brief with their questions, please.
Thank you so much for this wonderful presentation. So I had no idea. I come from Istanbul, Turkey, and I work on the late 19th, early 20th century entertainment business in Istanbul. So I had a very maybe naive but quick questions. So about the era you study, I thought of the what we had back in the time in Turkey. So sorry. I was wondering, my first questions, I was wondering if there were any drag performers. I can remember only one from my country. And the second question is, I know it's not related to your era, but I was wondering, so back in early 20th century, Muslim women could not be on stage until I think 1928 in the case of Turkey. And it was only Armenians and Greeks and other European actresses who could be on stage. I was wondering, back in that time, for Iran, if you could tell me if women could be on stage and how they could be on stage, whether it could be the Lowbrow theater or not. Thank you so much. The question was long, but I hope the answer will be
Thank you so much. Let's be kind.
Yes.
So I mean, usually, so in terms of usually men performed women. That was the thing that always happened. There are a lot of cases in Iranian theater that in women-only performances for women-only audience, the opposite also would happen. So that's one. For the next question, what was it? Muslim woman. I mean, so I think that's. So people always say that's a thing, and I've tried to look at it. Maybe other people know more than me. I haven't seen that as a rule or a law, right? But it's a practice. I would say for the popular performers, they were women motribs. They were even women motrib troop leaders, and So I've seen a lot of names, right? So that that was.
Thank you so much.
Do whatever. Give it to the other people.
I was going to, but their hands are not up now.
Okay.
Anyone else? Any other takers on questions?
Oh yeah.
I know your hand. That's
Thank you very much for your great presentation. I really enjoyed it, and I want to talk more about later. But so you talked about this narrative of Motrebi basically being a government conspiracy to bring down art, and I researched some Marxist texts on art, like Gur Sorhi or Sultanpur, who exactly said the same thing. There's good art, there's bad art, like government art, and then there is Motrebi, which is the worst because it's not even trying to be political pro-Shah, it's just destroying everything. But what was the government opinion actually on that topic? Because you only talked about this narrative against it.
Yeah. One thing that I do remember is that during the late 1950s, early 1960s, there was a discussion in the Ministry of Honer, Farhang و Hunar, Arts and Culture, that they should ban Motrebi theater, and so there was apparently there was a huge discussion about that. So I don't think there was a one kind of narrative that the government took over it, but they were also they had similar thoughts about. So a lot of them had similar thoughts about it as the leftist. Yeah.
Other questions?
Thank you for the excellent presentation. I was wondering about the backgrounds of these Motrabis that you've mentioned, coming from different provinces, from the south and the west and so on. Yeah. And whether there's a continuity between the folkloric bards in Iranian history and these practices. In Sistan Balochistan context, they call them the Pahlawans. And they are professional bards who perform music and perform, different life cycle celebrations. And so I was wondering if these people who are coming to the theater are also continuing to practice these sort of,
Sure. I mean, so you mean doing Pahlavani or that kind of thing, or? No. So in terms of continuation, it's a hard question to answer. It's hard to pinpoint that in history. There's a lot of people who do suggest that, those kind of continuation, but it's hard to pinpoint in history, and I don't want to say something that is not there. In terms of performing the Pahlavan kind of character, yes, that was part. So that is part of the Motrebi repertoires also there. So yeah.
Going back to the Motrebs and their impact in general, have you looked at their deep impact on Iranian culture, music, especially on traditional Iranian music and so forth, because of the improvisational nature of Persian traditional Persian music and the Motreb's
Yeah.
rendition of that music. Do you have any insights on that
Yeah.
to share?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I don't particularly work on music. There's an it's amazing if you want to look at it. I would say something about theater and briefly talk about theater. There is right now there is a kind of theater that is known as like popular theater, and they call it Teatr Azad, like free theater. And to my understanding, that's basically Motrebi theater in a new form. And it gets the exact same scrutinization that other things had. So it's like it's there, it happens there. There's obvious that this is the big part of our culture. So we can't say like, oh, it did influence that, but didn't anything else? It influenced everything. Yeah.
Thank you so much for your excellent presentation. I have multiple questions, but I just ask the first one. I'm wondering about the audience of Lalezar, because as you mentioned, at certain point of time, the collaboration between Motreb and Hunarmand started in Lalezar. So I can assume that this change would have some impact on the kind of audience. And also, I was wondering that if, because, probably people from working class or middle class could gain access to this kind of theaters. So what happened for, upper middle class who probably try to find another alternative? Just very quickly, the second question. I was wondering, it's somehow related to Augustine's question about overall state cultural policy. I was wondering how the recognition of Taziyeh as a kind of authentic form of theater during Farah Pahlavi time would impact the understanding of the state on theater in Iran. And is there any effect? Because, I believe that there is a paradigm shift in state cultural policies and at that time, especially regarding to Taziyeh as something authentic to Iranian culture. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So, there is a paradigm shift, absolutely. In 1960s happening is that there are a lot of governmental theaters being built outside of Lalezar in other places, and this also relates to your first question, kind of, and so the government is kind of taking over in some ways, taking over the avant-garde theater and new kind of theaters that are happening. The paradigm shift that is happening is from leftist theater to the avant-garde theater. But I still think that the Motrebi theater or the popular theater, it's still not in Pahlavi. It wasn't in Pahlavi's ideas as a legitimate good theater, nor it is right now. But you're right about Taziyeh, and that's true. That's true specifically about Taziyeh, but not Motrebi.
We can keep it short, please.
It's short. As an outsider, I've always been perplexed by the definition of theater and how it's distinguished from other things. Why is there a different form of governmental interest or regulation between singing, dancing, and word-related stuff? Because my own personal experience makes me think that certain kinds of dance are actually more like theater than word theater is.
Yeah, it's interesting because right now I can talk about government of Iran is that a lot of things actually can get a pass if you call them theater rather than if you call them music. it would be harder. If you call it dance, it's not like you can't do it, right? So that's the thing. Even women singing, which for whatever, so the government doesn't allow it. But when it happens in theater, it's a lot easier to be performed. Dance also, yeah.
خسته نباشی. Thank you so much. That was fascinating. I have so many questions, but we'll try to keep them brief. I want to start with just the kind of like dichotomy you set up between the motreb and the honarmand, the joyous dancer and the artist. And I appreciate that is what the talk is about, but I also wonder if there are other like titles or labels that fall out of this dichotomy that you look at all in your work. Similarly, other question about the broader project. One of the quotes you had about from one of the motrebs, you mentioned performance as a survival strategy, and I was very interested by this idea, and I was wondering if, again, you could expand on how else you think about this in your work. I was especially struck by the choice, and I don't know if this was part of the quote or if this is something you're working on, but whether it's a strategy, like why you chose strategy and not tactic, like again, from a performance of everyday life, the Surtovian, the tactic being for the people versus the strategy being for the state. So I was just like interested if this is at all part of it. And then lastly, just like something that's been circulating in the room, and again, we can have this conversation later, but I was again wondering, because of the ways you talk about the way that the figure of the motreb and pushing this figure to the background, whether or not you think that has something to do with how joy, because I look at popular performance and popular culture in Iran, for example, and joy is so seldom discussed, and there's such a strong association with grief and mourning, and if this, you think, how much this impacts it, because definitely there should be a correlation there, but would love to hear more. Thanks again.
Very good question. So for the last one, I mean, that's your work. I'm looking forward to your work. I do think that the specific like to the Communist Party also was kind of like against joy kind of idea. So it's so that's part of it, and then like the place they choose, they really didn't see what's like what was there as people wanted. It's an interesting thing. I mean that's absolutely there. The question about tactics and strategy, I haven't thought about it. Thank you for that. I'll think about it. I think you're right. I should use tactic. I'll check. What was the first question? Oh, other. Okay, so I mean, the dichotomy is there for me to like really show what the problem is. Obviously, there are a lot of in betweens, or there are a lot of like things that are outside. As like we just talked about ta'ziyeh, for example. Ta'ziyeh performers, a lot of them are not let's say, or we're not we're not always the literate people who like were in Tehran and we're in like Honaristan, Honar Pishagi, right? But there is always, like with ta'ziyeh performance, there is always that had always a leverage over the motrebi plays, which even the motrebs who during the Islamic Republic period, when the police would arrest them, and then they would say, "Oh, I know ta'ziyeh, I can do ta'ziyeh." Like there is some level there with ta'ziyeh that it's different. It's a bit outside of this dichotomy. There's a lot more. There's a lot of nuances to it. Absolutely.
It's late. Oh, okay. All right. Well, don't resent me. I'll ask this quickly. So I was interested in the title, the Unbearable Lightness. And so I think there's like more you can probably do with that. Like it seems to me, I'm going to skip so many steps, but it seems to me that the lightness of the motreb is the aspiration for freedom from social history integrated into the acting method. And I think that's something that is not being addressed. Like, why is the Tudeh party acting as if they are burdened by the heaviness of being? This is like Kundera's response to Nietzsche's eternal return of the same. So like when you invoke the lightness of being, there's a dialectic with multiple terms that you're simplifying. Like why is the Tudeh party not able to think joy? Yeah,
I think that's a very good question. I think, and I can think about it. I think sometimes I have to just choose my battle and what I'm like working on and what I'm not. But I would think about it. That's a very good. Actually, that's a very interesting way to think about it. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.